Something wonderful is happening. Something magic. Something that will change the way you think about high-tech entertainment. Sega World is coming to the Trocadero Piccadilly Circus in London. Welcome to the next generation of indoor entertainment.
If you ask someone, what was Sega famous for in the late 80s and early 90s, they'll probably respond with the Mega Drive, video games, the Master System, Sonic the Hedgehog, more video games, the Mega CD, and of course everybody's favourite, the Sega Pico Boss. But despite their dominance in the console market, Sega was, and still is, one of the dominant forces in arcade gaming and ride development and manufacturing. But for some reason, everybody tends to forget about this. So despite being a console gaming powerhouse in the 80s and 90s, Sega had a vision for the future of arcade gaming, and it wasn't an arcade cabinet, it wasn't a ride, it was a place, and its name was Sega World. This is the story of Sega World London. The story of Sega World London's origins actually begins over a decade before it opened in another continent. I'm going to take some time to explain what was going on in the arcade industry during the late 80s and early 90s, because it helps paint a clearer picture as to how Sega World came to be. The sad truth about arcades, at least in the United Kingdom, is that they've always had a reputation of being awful, and in the late 80s and early 90s, their reputation was at its lowest. Whilst many people who were children at the time look back on them with fond nostalgia, the vast majority of them were dark, smelly, and a number of them had major problems with crime and gangs. In the mid-80s, Japan's arcade industry also faced similar problems. Many of its most popular arcades are in such poor condition and had such a bad reputation that the Japanese government imposed strict new rules on their operation. Many of the big arcade cabinet providers and operators, including Sega, grew so concerned at the state of the industry in Japan that they felt the long-term health of their industry was at threat. Overnight, Sega announced and built new state-of-the-art venues which were bright and clean, built within tourist centres and popular shopping districts. Today, these places are known as Sega Worlds, or Sega Parks and Sega Joypolis, and it worked extremely well. They proved to be very popular and helped change the public perception of the arcade industry in Japan for the better. So whilst reform was going on in Japan and the industry was improving and becoming stronger and more healthy, things in the United Kingdom were not going so well. By 1991, the arcade's reputation was at an all-time low, but that was about to change. Looking at the success they'd had with transforming the arcade industry in Japan, Sega looked at the UK market and wondered, why can't we do the same for the UK like we've done in Japan? On July 24th, 1993, the first step to transforming the UK's arcade culture began, with the opening of Sega World Bournemouth. Despite the impression that it was a huge complex, it was actually quite a small arcade with a Sega-themed store, but it had unique features that most arcades at the time didn't have, like an on-site Burger King, a bowling alley, and eventually it even got an AS1 simulator ride. But Sega World Bournemouth is a story for another day. Today we're going to talk about the most famous of their UK arcade parks, Sega World London. I could potentially make an entire video dedicated to the number of Sega Worlds and Sega-themed arcade parks around the UK during the 90s. Because while Sega World London became the flagship venue in the UK, it wasn't the first Sega World to open. That honour went to Sega World Bournemouth. So how did Sega World London actually get started? The initial plan to open a London-based venue began shortly before Sega World Bournemouth opened in 1993. The exact depth of the planning at this time isn't known, but based on articles written regarding the opening of the Bournemouth venue, Sega had plans to open several venues around the UK and Europe on a near monthly basis once Bournemouth and London were firmly established. Firm plans were also in place to open other arcade venues around the world, such as GameWorks in the United States and Sega World Sydney in Australia. There were even plans for a Sega World in Paris, France. They were at the early stages of planning and were probably going to begin work once Sega World Sydney was fully completed. However, these plans completely fell through, but that's a story for another time. Originally, the planned Sega World London venue was to be a much smaller arcade attraction, set in a small part of London's Trocadero building, very similar to the Bournemouth model. The Trocadero building had already been home to a large indoor arcade known as Funland since 1990. Funland was run by Family Leisure, who had a reputation for getting some of the newest and largest arcade machines in the UK well ahead of the competition. Despite being home to several high-tech 3D virtual reality experiences, a walk-around attraction based on the Alien movies called Alien War, which became incredibly popular and rapidly raised the profile of the Trocadero. The Trocadero building itself was quickly running into financial troubles, and its owners were desperate to find a buyer to fill up all the empty spaces it still had in the higher floors of the complex. In 1994, the Burnford Group purchased a large part of the Trocadero, and 6 months later, following talks with Sega, they agreed to transform the originally planned smaller Sega World arcade into a large flagship entertainment complex. Sega immediately increased their investment in the Trocadero to over £45 million, which in today's money is just under £88 million or $111.5 million. Taking what the company had learnt from their Japanese Studiopolis venue, they would attempt to emulate the success of that in the UK. Precise details on the construction are unknown, but according to reports from several magazines at the time, it took 18 months to complete the park, and over 8 million man-hours were spent in total in order to complete the project. One little factoid that I did find amusing, which was released, was that during the construction, workers consumed over 270,000 sandwiches and drank over 900,000 cups of tea. As construction neared completion, several promotional events were held to help pitch the park to press and investors. Numerous concept artwork showing planned designs for the park were released, and even a promotional video was released, which used 90s era 3D graphics in order to create a virtual walkthrough of the park. During a press event, several large boards displaying various concept art were displayed showing the different floors and their representative theming. Interestingly, the initial designs for Sega World were to make it themed around the UK's Sonic the Comic. Several concept art designs show artwork from Fleetway's Sonic the Comic and the Sonic Yearbook spliced together to make a representation of the main lobby area of the park. The plans to theme Sega World based on Fleetway's Sonic the Comic ultimately didn't go ahead. However, there was one interesting discovery that I made. There are some actual designs and blueprints to create a statue based on one of Robotnik's surveillance devices, which appeared in a few early issues of Sonic the Comic. It was planned to be used in the carnival zone of the park, but it was ultimately dropped. And if you sat there thinking, there's no way they would have made Sega World themed on Fleetway's Sonic the Comic, well, Sega World Sydney was themed on Adventures of Sonic the Hedgehog, and they just put Sally in there as well, just because. Some of the designs that were shown in the early days did actually make it to reality, such as this artwork of Sonic in a racing car jacket holding a bottle of champagne. But one of the more interesting concepts, which was only discovered recently, was this piece of concept art for outside of the venue. Above the doorway, there would be a huge statue of Sonic, Tails and Knuckles. Sadly, this didn't go ahead, but there would be a Sonic statue in its place, which I'll discuss later. And whilst there were lots of images from the original concept and the final build, one aspect of the project which was constant from the start was the rocket escalator, which I'll talk about in a moment. On February 2nd, 1996, Sega appointed marketing agency Musto Merriman to be the marketing force behind Sega World. They were awarded a £1 million contract to produce TV and print adverts for the park. The adverts would be unlike the majority of theme park advertisements at the time, which were focused on showing customers the ride itself or the attraction. The plans for Sega World were to instead show the visitors' reactions to the rides, along with the slogan, "Try telling your brain it's not real." Oddly, 6 months after being awarded the contract, Sega then awarded a second contract to rival PR firm Consolidated Communications worth £80,000 in order to produce additional marketing and publicity material. In May 1996, prior to Sega World's opening, Sega held a huge promotional event at the Trocadero building in which the UK's Sonic mascot, along with with, well, it's either a Borg drone from Star Trek or a Cyberman from Doctor Who. The characters appeared on a construction platform outside of the venue and posed for a series of really awkward looking photographs. The world's media attended the event and several gaming magazines covered it at the time, but even for visiting tourists to London's Piccadilly Circus, it was hard to escape the promotion, as Sega also advertised the opening of the venue on the giant electronic billboards that Piccadilly Circus is famous for. There was another promotional event held during the construction in the form of a real-life Harrier jump jet being delivered to the Trocadero. Only one very low-quality photo exists of this event, but you can just make out the Sonic mascot costume at the time sat on the jet. If you're confused as to exactly what's going on in this picture, the Harrier jump jet is actually suspended in the air by a huge bungee cable. Sonic is sat on the jet as if he's the one flying it. The other figure is a policeman who's issuing Sonic with a speeding ticket. The Harrier jump jet would actually wind up inside Sega World itself as a display piece. And after £45 million was spent, 18 months of work and 8 million man-hours of labour, Sega World London was finally open. The transformation was complete and astounding. Sega had completely transformed the old Trocadero from an old shopping centre into a new, high-tech, futuristic indoor theme park. With the venue ready, a large opening preview day was organised in which members of the press, VIPs and celebrities were invited to see London's newest attraction. I'll talk about the reception to Sega World in a little while. First, we should actually look what was available inside and if the hype was worth the wait. Sega World London was located close to the heart of Piccadilly Circus, between Leicester Square and Piccadilly Circus Tube Station, and both underground stations heavily advertised the venue. The footage you're looking at right now was only recently discovered, and it's from 1996. A student walks between Leicester Square and Piccadilly Circus Tube Station, filming a slice of London life. But what he captures is some very rare imagery of Sega World, which to my knowledge, no Sega or Sonic fan site has ever reported on until now. When he exits the train into Leicester Square Tube Station, the escalator is full of posters advertising Sega World London being only a short walk away. He then walks through London streets towards Piccadilly Circus, and when he enters Piccadilly Circus Tube Station, his camera catches sight of a huge Sega World London billboard, indicating which exit from the station you need to take in order to get to the venue. Further inside, there's a second billboard with a busker playing music by it. The video itself is quite incredible, but the fact the student also accidentally captured these pieces of gaming history is something else altogether. So I mentioned in my Sonic statue video that there was a giant golden Sonic statue above the entrance to Sega World. I also mentioned that there weren't any decent quality images of it. Well, it's safe to say that's no longer the case. Several magazines from the time did in fact take some good quality photos of the statue, but would you believe there's some actual film of the statue? The footage you're looking at now is film from a movie that was shot at Sega World. Yes, that's right. Much to my amazement, when researching Sega World London, I discovered that there was actually a movie which shot a few scenes in and around the park. We'll come back to this later, because the movie is weird. There's also some lesser quality video of the statue, but what I like about this footage is the fact that they've caught the electronic billboard just below it, right as a Sonic animation appears to run from one side of the screen to the other. When guests entered the venue from the street, they would enter a small indoor shopping promenade, and ahead of them would be a very oddly shaped Sonic statue whose arms were at right angles. This is where guests would have to pay the entrance fee before climbing up the rocket escalator. The first two rocket escalators were the main entryway into Sega World itself. It appeared on virtually every concept art sketch and even in the 3D promotional video. It was the one core aspect of the original concept designs which survived into the final build. The escalator was the largest in the world which wasn't built underground. It was supported by a futuristic dome which was covered in bright lights to make it appear like some futuristic transporter of some kind. The escalator was designed in a way that it gave guests the impression that they they were leaving the real world behind and going to a futuristic funland where anything was possible. It was quite an unexpected highlight of someone's visit to the park. Many people praised this and actually considered it a must-go-on attraction. At the midway point, guests would stop at a podium constructed on the first floor of the Trocadero, which had a huge video wall. At that point, it was the largest in Europe. It showcased various promotional videos for attractions at the Trocadero itself, adverts from sponsors, and current music videos. Another attraction at this midway point was an animatronic show. At the top of the escalator, you would enter Sega World and be greeted by the now famous Sonic statue balancing the rotating globe on his finger. So once you were finally inside, where could you go? And what could you actually do in Sega World? Well, the venue was made up of 6 floors, each with a different theme, so I'm now going to talk about them in the order that you would experience them if you actually visited the park. When you boarded the rocket escalator, it automatically took you to the very top of Sega World, floor 6. This was the reception area where guests would have to buy their entry tickets and ride tokens for the various attractions. They also had a number of Sega Saturns that people could play on if they wanted to. It also was home to the Sonic statue with the globe, which is now quite an iconic figure in Sega World history. As in my statue video, I commented how there wasn't much in terms of good quality video of this statue. Well, that's no longer the case. This video clearly shows the statue and the rotating globe in action, making it the best video of the statue to currently exist. The 5th floor was the first floor to actually have games and attractions. It was known as the Combat Zone. This floor was home to mainly action arcade games. Approximately 70 titles including Time Crisis, Virtua Cop 2 and Virtua Fighter 3, which had its UK launch at Sega World and were available to play. But the main attraction for this floor was the venue's first ride, Beast in Darkness. And it also happens to be one of the most obscure attractions in the park, despite being an opening day attraction. The story is that deep within the Earth's core lurks a terrifying beast. Hungry for freedom, its favourite snack is children, who will be most welcome in its world of no shadows. Ooh, scary. Based on reports from people who went on the ride, it was basically a ghost house in which you would walk around in a near darkness environment, as various sensors would trigger sounds and lights to try and fool guests into thinking they were being hunted by a mysterious creature. Some live actors were also placed in this attraction who would regularly jump out at the guests and follow them through the darkness in order to try and scare them. There's no on-ride video of this attraction, but we do have this recently discovered video which shows what appears to be part of the ride's exterior. The 4th floor was home to the racetrack. This area contained 70 arcade cabinets and was heavily themed around F1 racing. Car models were actually built into the walls and the ceiling of this floor. Guests were able to play 8-player Daytona and Max TT Superbike, and on busy days, Sega would actually have staff members on hand to provide racing commentary to those who were playing those titles. One of the most impressive theming elements of this floor was the racing driver Sonic mural from the concept art, which was now displayed on the back wall, but the prime photo opportunity was in the form of the Williams team F1 racing car that Sega had actually sponsored back in the 90s. However, according to reports, the car was removed a few years into the park's life. The ride in this section was a virtual reality experience called Aqua Planet. It was actually a ride that was used at other Sega World parks called Aquanova, and it involved guests wearing 3D glasses going on an adventure to an undersea world as a giant squid attacks them. Guests would be able to fight the squid, and depending on how well they performed, they would get one of 3 unique endings. The 3rd floor was known as Flight Deck. It was basically a sky variant of the racetrack floor, featuring over 20 flight sim arcade cabinets. Many people would come to this floor just to try out Sega's R360 simulators. These are those machines that you would often see in movies, where players would be spun a full 360 degrees whilst playing various combat flying simulators. And remember the Harrier jump jet from the promotional stunt? This was actually on this floor, hanging from the ceiling. This floor also had a very impressive ride, which was one of the main reasons to visit the park. The VR-1 Space Mission combined virtual reality, hydraulics and other sensors to fully immerse guests into a spaceship environment. Guests were tasked to deliver information to the planet Bazco, destroying enemy ships and debris with their ship's weapons. The 2nd floor was home to the carnival, and it's exactly exactly what it sounds like. It was an area full of UFO catchers, prize redemption machines, and family-orientated attractions. There was also a large children's play area called Sega Kids. It was a Sonic-themed soft play area. The Sonic theming in this area is actually pretty cool, and there was a giant statue or wall display of a Chopper or Masha Badnik hanging from the ceiling. Giant gold rings and other Sonic imagery were also painted on the walls. When the park first opened, there was just one ride on this floor, but over the park's lifetime it would see 3 different rides in this area. The first ride was Ghost Hunt. It was an interactive ghost train, and it also appeared at Sega World Sydney. Unlike Beast in Darkness, you'd sit in a pod and ride around a track exploring a haunted house, but you'd be able to interact with the ghosts by shooting them. The second ride to open was House of Grandish. This ride was just a walk around attraction, which saw some animatronic and sometimes real human actors jump out at you for cheap scares. At the end of the attraction, you'd be given a certificate, which was your heart rate, which got recorded as you walked through the ride. This ride, however, wasn't very popular, and it was removed shortly after it was opened. The third ride to open was Power Sled, a bobsled simulator that would give guests the feeling of flying down a mountain at over 100 kilometers per hour. The final floor, or floor 1, was the sports arena, and this was home to over 90 sports-themed games, including Wave Runner and everybody's favourite, Sega Bass Fishing. This floor was also home to the incredible Sonic surfing statue, and during the making of this video, a few new photos of it came to light, which shows just how crazy this statue actually was. But this floor had 2 extremely noteworthy attractions, which were not in line with the sports theme at all. This floor had a Sega Sonic the Hedgehog arcade cabinet, and a Sonic the Fighters arcade cabinet placed right next to each other. This made Sega World one of only a handful of places to not only have one of these games, but both of them in the same spot. And the footage you're looking at right now is of someone actually playing these games at Sega World. This floor was also quite significant because it actually had a bar, and it was often used for corporate parties and private events. In fact, the footage you're looking at now is from one of these private corporate parties which was held at the park. The sports area was technically home to 3 rides: Megapolis, Tokyo City Battle, and Michael Jackson's Scramble Training. Both were simulators that gave guests some degree of control over their ride. People could use various controls to manipulate the adventure and change the outcome of each ride. The third ride was Mad Bazooka. Guests would sit in a small caged car and drive over small foam balls which are loaded into cannons, and you'd then have to fire these cannons at sensors on the opponent's vehicles in order to score points. This ride has actually appeared at a number of parks throughout the world. In fact, I even went on a version of it at Disney Quest several years ago. And speaking personally, this ride is actually quite a lot of fun, and it's really frantic when a ball impacts your cage and you're not expecting it. But according to reports, this ride was removed from the park in 1998 due to unknown reasons. So in terms of attractions and things to do, that's pretty much everything. But Sega World did have a few other amenities and services for guests which were available. As with many theme parks around the world, Sega had a number of characters and performers throughout the venue that would try and entertain guests. The flight deck level saw a windswept, old-timey pilot who would wander around and entertain guests with tales of his adventures in the skies. Another character was a werewolf-like monster that would try and scare the various guests. It's also believed that this performer would follow guests onto the Beast in Darkness ride to become part of the ride attraction and the scares itself. And there was also a Sonic mascot character present at the park. He would often be used for press events and corporate parties, but despite the park being heavily themed on Sonic, the park maps didn't tell guests when or where Sonic would appear during the day. And due to the lack of Sonic appearing in various home movies or non-professional photographs, it seems that he was quite a rare sight at the park itself. There would also sometimes be live music and various bands that would perform at the park, but these seem to be limited to corporate events or private hire parties. From the very first day, Sega World had a strict no outside food or drink policy, but if guests were hungry or wanted something to drink, they did have a few choices. Sega World had 2 on-site McDonald's. The first was placed right next to the kids' play area on floor 2, and a second McDonald's was also located next to the Sega store on floor 1. Guests could also purchase light refreshments from various stalls and carts throughout the park. Exact details on these are not known, but I'm gonna guess that Pepsi was definitely on the menu, because the Trocadero building wasn't just completely Sega World, it also had a few other attractions. The Trocadero was also sponsored by Pepsi, and at one point the Trocadero was actually called Pepsi Trocadero. For several years, the site had the UK's first 3D IMAX cinema, which was also sponsored by Pepsi. And in 1997, Pepsi would open and build a huge freefall ride called the Pepsi Max Drop. Madame Tussauds also had a waxwork attraction called Rock Circus. These were not part of Sega World itself, but were strong supporting attractions for the entire Trocadero complex. So let's talk about the gift shop, which was also known as the Sega Store. Sega World London had its own gift shop called the Sega Store, and it was full of exclusive Sega World London products, which were not available anywhere else in the world. Whilst there were a few cheap basic products like wallets and t-shirts, the Sega Store also had some insane items which are now extremely rare and often sell for insane prices between collectors, such as this leather Sega World jacket and this other very elaborate jacket. But some of the more highly desired items come in the form of smaller collectibles, such as this small Sonic figure and these Sega World London pin badges. The only photo of the store to exist anywhere is this exterior picture of the sign. Absolutely no photo or video from inside the store exists anywhere. However, there have been a few insights over the years as to what was actually available in the store in terms of exclusive Sega World London merchandise. Aside from items which people still have in their collections from when they first visited the park in the 90s, various old magazines actually had order forms which allowed readers to mail order products directly from the store. One order form was available in the pages of Fleetway's Sonic the Comic, but the more interesting form only exists in a really low quality image. But based on these documents, we know that some of the items you could get from Sega World London included Sega games, CD and vinyl record carry cases, water bottles, backpacks, and even cufflinks, which came in this mini presentation box. There was also a really cool attraction that you could actually go on, which gave you a really cool, unique souvenir, and I'm very lucky to actually own this. There was a machine in the park, and if you inserted a 1p coin and then turned a crank, the machine would crush the coin and engrave Sonic onto the coin along with the words Sega London. You've probably seen some of these before, but I've never seen one to print a video game character onto them. I mentioned earlier that ahead of the opening day, Sega hosted a special press preview event in which the world's media and celebrity VIP guests were invited to attend. The preview event was a major occasion. Popular celebrities from 1996 attended the preview, including Brian May, Jules Holland, Robbie Williams, and even Her Royal Highness the Duchess of York. Alongside the mainstream media were representatives from the world's most popular gaming magazines at the time. And since I've just explained all the content that was at the park and everything you can do, how do you think the press preview event went? Well, let me give you a hint by playing this music from Sonic 1. In the weeks following, articles about Sega World London were mixed to highly negative, and this reception would also continue when the park actually opened for paying visitors. Some examples of the opening day reviews were as follows. The Daily Telegraph described the park as little short of a disgrace and a joyless tourist trap. Cosmo Landsman of the Sunday Times described the park as tacky, and John Tribe of the Times reported the experience to be a glitzy con trick. Tom Whitewell of The Guardian said, "It's not all that different from your local shopping centre," and described the ride technology as nearly always obvious and unsuitable. But the biggest negative reaction came from Computer and Video Games magazine, who wrote a large review on the park in their November 1996 issue, in which they described all the rides as being abysmal. Beast in Darkness they utterly hated, Aqua Planet they described as being boring, and only people with an overactive imagination would even come close to thinking it was real. They were also highly critical of the ride wait times and felt it was a big rip-off that wasn't worth the price of admission. The park had numerous issues which ultimately came down to poor planning. The first big issue was that most of the rides at the time could only allow 40 people to ride them every hour. Even during the press preview night, members of the press and VIPs were waiting a long time just to get on a ride. When the park was fully open, the wait times were extremely long. Another issue with the park was that many felt their wallets were constantly under assault. To actually enter the park cost between £9 to £12 per person, but once you got inside, you quickly discovered that almost nothing was free. The arcade games would cost anywhere from 20 pence to £1, and the rides would cost as much as £3 per rider, and the McDonald's prices were all hiked up to theme park rates. To give some perspective, an adult would be charged £12 to enter the park and a child would be charged £9. For a family visiting the park of 2 adults and 2 children, they would have to pay £42 just to enter the park, and in today's money that's £77 or just under $100. And then you had to factor in the added expense of playing any of the arcade games, going on any of the rides, eating food at the overpriced McDonald's, and then the Sega store. It was an extremely expensive trip. To further add to insult, there were no concession tickets to pensioners or students, there were no family or group tickets of any kind, outside large discounts given to private corporate events or large school trip bookings. Visiting Sega World in the 90s was very expensive, and whilst London attractions have a reputation for high prices, Sega were offering far too little for what they were charging. Despite the near universal negative reaction to how much it was to visit and the cost of everything inside, Sega World did receive a lot of positive praise for the theming, especially the rocket escalator. Even computer and video games loved it. But the complaints regarding the pricing continued for months, and Sega World started to get very poor reviews and a bad reputation, which started to impact the tourist numbers. Initially, Sega World were able to cope with this negative reception. Staff working at the time reported that many businessmen and women from London's wealthy districts were drawn to the park, and there was a regular loyal fan base of arcade enthusiasts who attended Sega World due to it being the only place at the time to access several high-profile arcade games, like Virtua Fighter 3. But by the end of the first year, several arcades just down the road from Sega World also had these games, and they didn't charge money just to enter. Another way Sega World made a lot of money was from the use of private hire. Companies could book entire floors as well as the entire venue if they wanted to. Other ways that the park made money was from the use of media and press events. One example of this was in 1997 when the Saracens Rugby Club hired the entire venue for a press event in which Francois Pienaar signed for their team. But this wasn't enough, and complaints from members of the public became so numerous that Sega took several steps to try and quell the problem. First, they put all the arcade cabinets on free play, but that failed to work. People saw the high ticket price to enter and assumed that they would still be ripped off on entry. So Sega then reduced the entry fee to £2, but put the arcade machines back to their opening day pricing. Eventually, the park became free to enter and attendance soared. The exact numbers for when the park went free to play are not known. However, when the park was charging £2 just to enter, the Sega World PR manager did quote the following numbers. On a school day, they would expect around 3,000 visitors. This would increase to 5,000 visitors per day on average during the school holiday season. The record for total number of people to visit Sega World on a single day was 5,800. Despite the opening day problems, Sega World remained open for 3 years, and in that time a few noticeable events happened. Several very high-profile celebrities attended the park over the years, including the band Hanson. They actually visited Sega World London and recorded a small amount of pretty bad footage for one of their VHS tapes at the time. It's interesting because later they actually went to perform in concert at Sega World Sydney. Maybe they were Sega fans. A large number of TV shows were also also filmed at the park. They were mainly gaming news shows which used Sega World as a backdrop. Occasionally you'd see a glimpse of a famous Sega World Sonic statue, but nothing else really happened. So this next event that I'm going to talk about was actually described as a promotion by Sega World's PR manager at the time. This was an event which was run in conjunction with a number of banks that were based in London, and I should probably preface this by saying I'm legitimately quite shocked that this actually happened. So I'm going to describe it as it was written in the pages of Saturn Power back in 1997. In the UK during the 1990s, there was a model by the name of Joe Guest who would often be hired to walk around various places wearing just a bikini or a swimsuit. So in conjunction with JP Morgan investment bankers, Joe Guest was hired to walk around Sega World in a very revealing swimsuit. She would then approach the male visitors who were there playing various games. The bankers would then place bets on how long it would take her to distract the men away from the games that they were playing. Whoever won the competition, and I don't know how they decided the winner, would win the star prize, which was a date with Joe Guest. No, really, this was an actual promotional competition that was held in Sega World. Just what were they thinking with this? This is an exact quote from Karen Kelly, who was the Sega World PR manager at the time. The competition was done to answer the age-old question, are girls better than games? I just feel legitimately sorry for everyone who is involved with this. Moving on. But this is arguably the most significant event. I mentioned earlier that there was actually a movie filmed at Sega World, which is why there's some really good footage of the golden statue. Well, several other scenes were actually shot inside the park itself. The movie is called That, which roughly means baby animal in English. The film is about a guy who suffers from a medical condition called Peter Pan syndrome, in which he never grows out of his childlike attitude. It's a pretty awful movie, as well as having a very cruel story. The plot of the movie is that his parents take him to London on holiday, and they effectively abandon him, so he's forced to grow up and make his way back to Italy. As awful as the film is, the short scenes give us some of the best shots of the park. We see loads of details on the walls of the racetrack floor. There are several cars actually part of the wall's scenery. The sequence shows a number of arcade machines, as well as a glimpse of the Harrier jump jet in the flight deck area. There's also a very brief glimpse of the surfing Sonic statue, and what I believe could also be the Sega store in the background. We also see a change machine, and even evidence that Sega had capsule redemption prize machines. The entire sequence is just so surreal. It's virtually an advert for the park in every sense. It does make me wonder if there were any other movies or TV shows that were actually filmed here as part of a plot and not just backdrops for various gaming news segments. Whilst Sega did take steps to fix the reputation of the park, things started to go downhill quite quickly. Part of the original agreement with the Trocadero, made in 1994, was that Sega would keep running the park if it was profitable by the tune of £3 million during the first 3 years of its operation, and in today's money, £3 million is just over £5.5 million, or just under $7 million. That's a very difficult target to achieve. They also predicted that the park would see at least 1.7 million visitors in the first year, but the reality was only 950,000 people entered the gates of Sega World. Even the owners of the Trocadero were seeing very little return for their investment into the Sega World park. To try and turn things around, Sega World dropped the entry fee completely, and all arcades were brought back to their original opening day charges. Guests now welcomed the new free entry, and attendance radically increased at the park, but the park was still suffering financially. The issue was, now that the park was free, some guests would enter the park and only play on one arcade game. Other times, visitors would just come in, walk around, and then leave without spending any money. The arcade industry in the UK was also on a sharp decline in the later half of the 1990s, and with Sega failing to hit the £3 million over 3 years target, Sega agreed to end their partnership with the Trocadero, and slowly all Sega World assets and branding started to get removed from the park before the space was completely sold back to Funland. Due to the lack of money that the park was making, both Sega and the Trocadero seemed to just be glad to see the back of it. Even Nick Laszlo, who owned the Burford Group, which bought the Trocadero and helped make Sega World happen, sensed that the park wouldn't last right from the opening day. During the press preview day, he was actually in attendance, and when he saw how long the lines were getting, with just a small crowd of selected members of the press, he's actually gone on record to say, "My heart sank. Sega could not deliver what they said they'd deliver. It looked amazing, but their rides were not capable of delivering the number of people they needed to deliver to support the operation. People were queuing for ages. It was a question of over-anticipation and under-delivery." To put this into perspective, Sega World could operate with a maximum capacity of 3,000 visitors. Its rides could only handle 40 people per hour. Following the closure of Sega World, Funland slowly began to strip all the Sega World theming and remaining Sega World rides from the Trocadero. As time went on, guests would visit the park to find more and more floors had been closed off. Even temporary walls were constructed to keep guests out of certain areas, and the rocket escalator, the one thing that everybody loved, was blocked off by a vending machine for several years. And yes, that is a Tails plush sat on top of it. Due to how quickly certain areas of the park were walled off, like one day they would be completely open and the next there was a temporary wall in place, several internet rumours started up that some of the largest Sega World assets, like the giant statues and even the entire inventory of the Sega World store, was actually still at the venue behind one of the temporary walls. Today though, the Trocadero is now virtually non-existent. Major refurbishments have taken place which have turned the building into an empty shell. This video taken by Urban Explorers shows that virtually nothing remains. All the escalators have been removed. The only trace that Sega World even existed are a few leftover graphics on one of the walls. If you compare a still scene from the Italian movie, it pretty much matches. So what of the legacy of Sega World London? In terms of the park as a business, Sega Worlds began to decline shortly after the London venue closed down. Sega World Sydney would close the following year in November 2000, citing very similar reasons to London. Most of the Sega parks in the Sega Worlds around the UK also closed down within the next few years, and plans to build a Sega World in Paris were completely scrapped. Instead, Sega supported Disneyland Paris by supplying them with various arcade attractions. But over in Japan, Sega's Joypolis is still open to this day, and Japan also has several smaller Sega Worlds and Sega parks which are still in operation. But for the fans that we're lucky enough to visit, most recall having very fond memories of Sega World London. There's now a small army of fans who never got to go, and they lament that fact. I for one really wanted the pewter pin badge from the park if anyone has it. Many fans still discuss the idea that a new Sega World could open someday, either in the United States or in Europe. Whilst I personally would love to see this, and would be there on opening day if it actually happened, I just don't see this happening. Aside from the cost to set one up, very few cities in the world have the population or regular worldwide tourism to even make an indoor theme park a success. Even Disney failed to do it, with their own indoor Disney Quest theme parks. But remember what I said at the start of the video, that arcades in the UK had an awful reputation in the early 1990s, and part of the reason for Sega World was an attempt to strengthen the arcade industry. So did this work? Whilst the UK still has some really awful arcades, they're mainly found in seaside towns. Most new arcades do try to follow the Sega World model, that being a dedicated building, clean, bright and safe. There are now specialist arcade venues which try to emulate the Sega World model. Sega themselves have also started to open new arcades called Sega Prize Zones. They can be found across the UK. Normally they're in bowling alleys or other small entertainment venues. Ironically for me, there's actually a flagship Sega Prize Zone in my own town, and it often gets new arcade cabinets ahead of others for testing. It even has a giant Sonic statue welcoming guests to the arcade. And what happens when you cash in your prize tokens? You get this little receipt. It nearly says Sega World in the city you're in. It's close enough. So whilst I think a new Sega World similar to that of London and Sydney is highly unlikely, the legacy of Sega's goal to make arcades safe and appealing clearly had an impact. So for that, you could say that Sega World did impact the industry for the better. But what about you? Did you ever get the chance to visit Sega World or even a Sega park? Please let me know in the comments, and if you happen to have any photo or video of these places, please upload them. There's so much that we don't yet know, and so much media from this place that we haven't seen yet. And if you didn't go to it, share your thoughts on this place in the comments. I'd love to read them. I for one really wish I had the chance to go visit it, if only so I could just get my hands on that damn pewter Sega World Sonic pin badge. See you next time. If you enjoyed this look at the magical place that was Sega World London, please hit that like button, and don't forget to subscribe and click the bell notification button in order to find out when I next upload a video. Also, if you'd like to continue the adventures, please follow me on Twitter for more fun and future video updates. The work I do wouldn't be possible without the incredible support from my Patreon donators. If you'd like to join them and further support the work I do, please consider backing me via the links in the video description. But most of all, just thank you for taking the time out to enjoy the work I do. It really does mean the world to me. Thank you.